Question 5. Atrens. An early entomologist observed ants carrying particles to neighboring ant colonies and inferred that the ants were bringing food to their neighbors. Further research, however, revealed that the ants were emptying their own colony's dumping site. Thus, the early entomologist was clearly wrong. Alright, so argument or facts. Clearly we have an argument here. Thus would be our structural indicator of conclusion. So our conclusion is that the early entomologist was wrong. Well, wrong about what? Well, he observed ants carrying particles to a neighboring ant colony and inferred that they were bringing food. However, further research showed us that they were actually emptying their own colony's dumping site. Therefore, he was wrong, or they were not bringing food to their neighbors, right? So you notice clearly a flawed argument. There's a major gap in this argument. To relate to it, imagine I said this. My neighbor observed me carrying my trash out to my trash cans, and ants happen to live in my trash cans. And from this, my neighbor concluded that I was bringing food to the ants. Later on, it was determined that I was actually bringing out my trash, and therefore my neighbor would say I was not bringing food to the ants. And you notice how that's a major gap, right? Just because it's trash doesn't mean it's not food, right? As an example of humans bringing out trash would clearly demonstrate, some people's trash is another person's treasure, right? Ants eat garbage, so just because this is a dumping site, how does that make it true that the entomologist was wrong? It's possible that not only were they emptying their colony's dumping site, but they were also bringing food because the dumping site had particles of food in it. So now we turn our attention to the question stem. Atrens' conclusion follows logically if which one of the following is assumed. Again, follows logically if. So strengthen with sufficient premise question. So not only trying to strengthen this argument, trying to find the super premise that will 100% guarantee the conclusion. And again, the conclusion was that this early entomologist was wrong. All right, so now let's take a look at A. Ant societies do not interact in all the same ways that human societies interact. Fantastic. That is completely irrelevant. Does not even strengthen this argument. We are not talking about ant societies versus human societies. We're talking about this one ant colony bringing particles of food to the neighbors. Later on, finding out it was actually them emptying their own dumping site. What does this have to do with the way ant societies interact compared to the way human societies interact? A is completely irrelevant, does not strengthen, and definitely does not guarantee the conclusion. Moving to B, there is only weak evidence for the view that ants have the capacity to make use of objects as gifts. Again, completely irrelevant. So you notice what B is trying to make you think that because there's only weak evidence for the view that ants have the capacity to make use of objects as gift, that strengthens this conclusion that the entomologist was wrong, not only because we found out that they were emptying their own colony's dumping site, but also because there's weak evidence that they can make use of objects as gift, so the likelihood that they were giving food to their neighboring ant colony is unlikely. But again, we're not trying to strengthen, we are trying to guarantee the conclusion that this entomologist was wrong, and the fact that there's only weak evidence for the view that ants have the capacity to make use of objects as gifts does not guarantee the conclusion, so B would be out. Which brings me to C. Ant dumping sites do not contain particles that could be used as food. And you notice C is exactly what we talked about before. How can we jump from the fact that we figured out that they were emptying their own colony's dumping site to conclude that they were not bringing food to their neighbors? That is what it means when it says the early entomologist was wrong. Well, the early entomologist believed they were bringing food to their neighbors. And if he was wrong, then they were not bringing food to their neighbors. But again, to guarantee that conclusion, we would have to say that these dumping sites don't have particles of food. And that is exactly what C says, which would guarantee the conclusion that the early entomologist was wrong because there is no overlap between dumping sites and particles of food, therefore guaranteeing the conclusion 100%. But again, let's make sure here, checking D, the ants to whom the particles were brought never carried the particles into their own colonies. Again, completely irrelevant. What difference does it make if these ants brought the particles into their own colony? We're talking about the neighboring ant colony bringing what we believed were particles of food to their neighbors. Later on, we found out that it was actually trash, and taking that to conclude that the early entomologist was wrong. What does the fact that ants to whom the particles were brought never carried the particles in themselves, just telling us that these ants are very lazy, basically some royalty ants that we have. They don't lift a finger themselves. But what does that have to do with this argument? You notice it doesn't have anything to do with it, doesn't strengthen, definitely doesn't guarantee. Moving to E, the entomologist cited retracted his conclusion when it was determined that the particles the ants carried came from their dumping site. And E clearly strengthens this. The entomologist retracted his original statement after it was found that they were emptying their trash. But again, we're not just trying to strengthen this argument, we're trying to 100% guarantee it. And just because the entomologist retracted his own statement doesn't mean he was actually wrong. He could have done it because he felt ashamed, embarrassed, right? So E, again, does not guarantee the conclusion that he was wrong. It definitely strengthens it, but this is a strengthen with sufficient premise question. So not only must we strengthen, we must find the super premise that 100% guarantees the conclusion.